Remember the Forgotten.
Chapter 17. Adventure Awaits. Aurora sat by the small wooden desk which lay beside the door of her room in the Drinking Demon. It was far too small for comfort, and its legs wobbled constantly as she hunched over it, sketching quickly yet precisely on the large square of parchment she'd procured from Samuel. For all her life, her drawings had been of the places she'd longed for, the great outdoors and lands with beauty vast and brilliant, of excitement she wished she felt and people she wished she could meet. Today, however, it was different. She'd spent the evening talking to her new companions, asking curious question after curious question, learning as much about them as she could. She had asked about the Forgotten, about Jade, but the three who surrounded Samuel held even more stories of incredulity than she could ever have hoped. They'd travelled the land for miles, fought all manner of strange creatures and people. They'd lived the life she'd always fantasised about having. And, despite it, all of the excitement and hope for what was to come now in the early hours of this dark night, her mind was drawn to only one person. Her quill scribbled across the paper, filling in the details of Zircon's face. He was so inexperienced in the world, she thought, perhaps even more so than herself. And yet, he was so brave and willing to put his trust in her to help him find his way. Her quill moved on to his hair, long black lines unobscured by his cloak hood, which she had drawn down. He was so incredibly special, she thought, and she knew that him barging into her home those days previous was the best thing to ever happen to her. "Come in," she called, not taking her eyes off of her artwork. The door squeaked on its hinges as it rattled its way open. Behind it, hand clutching the doorknob still, Zircon stepped forth. "May I come in?" Aurora swept her drawing off of the table almost instantly, allowing it to flutter and float down to the ground on the far side. She turned to face Zircon and looked towards him with wide eyes. "Of course." Zircon closed the door behind him and strode over toward the bed, slowly lowering himself to a sitting position upon its edge. His eyes wandered the room for a moment, and then he spoke. "So, how are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm feeling much better, actually," replied Aurora, giving him a smile. "What about you?" "I'm fine," he answered. "It's a nice place." Aurora turned round in her chair, buzzing with sudden energy. "It's all so exciting, isn't it? I can't wait to find out where that map leads. What do you think we'll find? Ancient ruins? Buried treasure?" Aurora's joyful and excited energy surprised Zircon, having seen her so glum and hopeless over the last day. He didn't understand her interest at all, and he was internally divided on how to feel about it. He angled his gaze towards the ground, hiding his uncertain expression behind a curtain of black hair. "I've always wanted to do something like this," continued Aurora, to be part of something big, to go on an adventure. It still feels scary, knowing I've forgotten so much, but I feel I can take solace in knowing that my future is going to be far brighter than my past. "Look, Aurora," Zircon attempted, lifting his head slightly. She watched him expectantly as he paused and scratched the back of his head. "What is it?" I'm not sure this whole forgotten thing is a good idea," he eventually finished. Aurora's brow immediately furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I just mean, I'm not sure about it." Aurora's eyes looked down on him with confusion, worry, and disappointment. "About what exactly?" "Well, I mean," he strained, we don't even really know who these people are, do we? I mean, we just met them in a pub at the end of the day. Aurora scrutinised his face, trying to understand. You don't trust them? It's not a matter of trust, Aurora, Zircon replied. I just don't know if we should go off with a bunch of strangers we just met. We don't even know if any of what they're saying is true. Surprise washed over Aurora's already complex countenance. What if I'd said the same thing when you came barging through my door? I would have left you to the guard. Okay, yes, I can see that, continued Zircon, but what I'm just trying to say is I don't think we should go with them tomorrow. But we have to go, Aurora asserted firmly. They need our help. Do they though? Questioned Zircon. If they want to go romping in the woods after some ancient creature or some crazy sorceress or whatever, they can, but I don't really see why we should get involved. You're a nobleman, exclaimed Aurora. It's your duty to help people. Zircon met her eyes with sudden vigour. Aurora, look, there's another option for us. That gem we found is huge and flawless, not to mention magical. We could sell it, Aurora. We could be rich. Aurora froze, and a silence filled the air as she tilted her head, and Zircon began to realise his quite large mistake. But you're already rich. Zircon opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come to him in time. Is there something you're not telling me? Aurora asked. Zircon's mouth twisted as he stumbled over his words. No, I may have just a little embellished some aspects of my story. What did you remember when you looked into the eye? Aurora's sudden question was quick and sharp, as if what Zircon had just said no longer held weight in the conversation. He looked back at her wordlessly, shifting eyes betraying his guilt. You aren't a nobleman, are you? Zircon's tightly held breath slowly released to reluctantly utter the words he could never have imagined himself saying. Not as such, no. Aurora's gaze moved to the floor, then to the ceiling, and then back to Zircon. Her facial expression too, shifting to demonstrate the realisation she slowly came to. She looked her companion dead in the eyes with a sad fierceness that he had yet to witness, and asked, Was anything you told me actually true? Zircon froze. His jaw slowly opened as he met her gaze with one of unhideable exposure. His mind screamed at him to lie some more. He knew he could, and he figured there was a decent chance that she would believe him. But what would be the point? Where would it get him? For the first time in his life, he had nothing to gain from hiding the truth. He didn't want her to believe him. He wanted her to agree with him. He drew a deep breath and finally answered her. No. Aurora stood up from her chair and put her hand to her temple, letting out an exasperated chuckle choked with emotion. Why would you lie to me like that? Why? I had to, Zircon swiftly answered. You never would have helped me escape Tinvernet if I hadn't concocted a story. I'd be rotting in the dungeons by now. Aurora shook her head gently in disbelief, glaring at Zircon angrily. So you're what? A common criminal? Zircon leapt to his feet and to his defence, the crack of his boots against the floorboards echoing around the room as he spoke. What difference does it make now? If we get the eye, we'll be rich, Aurora. Richer than any nobleman. So it was all lies, Aurora hissed. Everything you told me was all lies. I believed it myself for a good while, reminded Zircon. But don't you understand? You made it a reality for me when you told me that was who I was. Now I can make it a reality for the both of us. You're the one not understanding, Aurora spat. "I don't care if you're a nobleman or not. You're a liar. Why did you even come with me all this way? I helped you escape. Why are you still here?" Zircon sighed. Because... Look, this gem is the prize of a lifetime. But I can't leave you behind, not now. Please, just come with me. "I don't even know you," Aurora growled. "Get out." "But Aurora, get out!" Zircon opened his mouth again, as if to speak, but the first word cut off before it could be understood. After all, he really couldn't think of anything more to say. Lying was easy. In some ways, being honest was easy too. But now, neither could help him, and he felt well and truly stuck. He slowly and wordlessly stood up from the creaking bed. He swallowed hard, stifling an upsetness he didn't know he felt, and made his way to the door. After pulling it open, he stared at the open frame for a moment. He could feel Aurora's angry gaze on him still. He didn't look back. As he stepped out into the dark corridor which housed the rooms they'd been given, he took a deep but tense breath. There was a strong chill in the air, the warmth from the recently doused fireplace on the other side of the building not coming close to being able to warm the stale walls. His eyes wandered around, glaring with angst at every sight, yet unable to keep still. His mind raced with thought, in a way it never had before. He didn't need her, he told himself. He was stupid for thinking anyone would ever care about him. As ever, he could rely on one thing and one thing alone, himself. Himself and the gold in his pocket. With his cloak draped over his body, he stepped slowly and quietly towards another door down the corridor, placing his heels down carefully on the creaky floorboards. He reached down and gripped the brass doorknob, twisting it in slow, intermittent rotations until the rough wood of the door began to shift loose from its frame and open. It creaked awfully, causing him to cringe, and so he began to carefully squeeze through the narrow gap instead of opening it all the way. Soon enough, he found himself inside the room, the door barely ajar behind him, and staring at the unconscious figure on the bed. Samuel was asleep, thankfully, but lay on his front, his hands seemingly clutching something buried underneath his slumbering form. Zircon sighed and slowly tiptoed toward the bed, then kneeling down beside it and crawling underneath its frame. Once he was sufficiently covered, he reached his arm up around the bed and tapped Samuel ever so slightly on the shoulder. Then he withdrew his hand sharply and retreated back into cover. The bed creaked and showered him with a gentle layer of dust as there was movement above. He listened carefully as the weight seemed to shift toward the centre, then to the right, and then, after a number of seconds, returned to where it was. Zircon remained there, contorted beneath the shelter of the bed, for minutes, until he was finally confident it was safe. As he dragged himself out from beneath the bed, with some grunts and groans that he no longer had the patience to mask, he rose to his feet and peered once more at Samuel. He was asleep again, only now the object in his hands was not buried underneath him. Instead, he slept on his side, clutching a small pouch close to his chest. Inside the pouch, the shape of the Forgotten's eye was clearly visible. Zircon nodded to himself and slowly extended his arm to retrieve it. The pouch was soft, and it seemed to slide effortlessly from Samuel's lax grip. Pulling the pouch open slightly, Zircon peeked in, just to make sure, then placed the eye carefully in one of his cloak pockets before retreating back out of the door into the dim light of the corridor. As he snuck his way further along the corridor and eventually into the main room of the tavern, illuminated by the pale, glimmering moonlight which poured unopposed through the large glass windows of the front wall, Zircon finally allowed himself to relax a little. His posture slouched, and his breathing became deeper and more full. When he reached the front door, he permitted himself a slight smile and stepped through into the cold night air. Suddenly, he bumped into something in front of him. No, someone. He stumbled back from the collision, more discombobulated than he ought to be, and looked ahead as his eyes adjusted to the bright light of the moon against the night. In front of him, James turned around to meet his gaze. "Sorry," he said, giving a half wave in greeting. "Didn't see you there." Zircon had already thrown his hands into his pockets, holding the orb slightly aloft in one of them to disguise its pronounced shape. My apologies," he then stammered in reply. I should have looked where I was going." Zircon took a moment to look around him, taking in the sight of the dark village, as empty of people as it was of sound. No light flowed from the windows of the many small buildings, so the slivers of moonlight seeping through the sky were the only source of light. In the darkness, the peaceful clouds floating by looked like storm clouds. As he looked back toward James, Zircon coughed, as if to shake a build-up of honesty from his system. "So, what are you doing out so late?" he asked. "Just enjoying the night air," James replied, looking up towards the sky. For a few moments, the pair stood silent, not meeting each other's gaze, as they awkwardly surveyed their surroundings. Eventually, James broke the silence with a question. "So, what's your story then?" "I'm a nobleman," Zircon answered, this time quick and free of hesitation. "From Helmhaven. Mine's the old Barton place." "Nobleman, eh?" James pondered. "Don't see many of them down this way." Zircon let out a non-committal grunt and shrugged his shoulders, bouncing himself back and forth on his heels for a few seconds. He took a deep breath, visible in the cold air, and indicated again to the stoic man beside him. "So, guess I'd better head back inside then." "Sure," said James, not looking back at him. "Sleep well." "You too," Zircon returned, pressing his hand against the door before momentarily turning back towards James's gazing figure. "Actually, you look pretty tired. Maybe you should turn in for the night as well." James gave him an unreadable look. "Think I'll stay out here a little longer, actually." "All right," said Zircon. "And how long do you think that'll be?" "As long as it needs to be," replied James. "And how long is that?" James turned his head to look at Zircon finally, half his face aglow with the light of the moon, as he gave nothing away with his blank expression. "You tell me." Zircon remained wordless in his stance for a moment, like a scared deer. "Good night then," he eventually said. With that, he pushed open the door with a loud, prolonged creak, and gently tread through the loud and empty tavern space before returning to the corridor, and eventually the bitter-sweet warmth of his bed. When the morning came, Aurora awoke to a gentle knock on her door. With no windows in the room, it lay hazy and dim, giving her no method by which to discern the time. When she groggily opened the door, rubbing her eyes, she saw the smiling figure of Pasley. Illuminated by the brilliant rays of a white sun pouring through the window behind him, he stood aside and gestured toward the main room. "Adventure awaits," he said, a sarcastic but good-natured smile planted upon his lips. After getting her things, she followed him downstairs and into the main room of the tavern, where a busy Sapphire heaved 2 heavy packs onto her arms and joined them as they made their way past the splattering of early morning drinkers into the bright sunlight of the outside. James leaned against the wall just outside the front door, arms crossed and eyes half closed. Paz whistled at him as he walked by. Then, grinning, as James suddenly jumped to alertness. I'm awake, he insisted, jolting upwards and looking around quickly. Behind them, Samuel walked through the door, holding his satchel close to his chest, and made his way towards the horses. Do you still have the eye, Sam? James asked, pushing himself from the wall and walking alongside him. Of course, Samuel replied, then rustling through his satchel to pull out the small pouch he was keeping it in and showing it to James. Could I see it quickly? Requested James, eyes moving between the round pouch in Samuel's hand and the restless figure of Zircon standing hunched beside the horses. Samuel furrowed his brow, but nonetheless handed over the pouch to James. Any particular reason why? James proceeded to pull the cord of the pouch and opened it up. Looking in, he saw the red gem sitting safely inside. James? Samuel asked again. It's nothing to worry about, James then assured him, though his eyes said differently. Just can't be too careful at the moment, right? James looked for a moment longer at the unmistakable red glow of the eye, before again tying up the pouch and handing it back to Samuel. Aurora smiled at her companions as they walked toward the three horses. Half-packed, they sat patiently across the road. Then she stopped. Beside one of the horses, almost scowling at the ground with his hands stuffed into his pockets, stood Zircon. What's he still doing here? She muttered bitterly, almost to herself. James heard her and stopped to look. Is there a reason he shouldn't be here? Zircon's eyes flicked up to look at Aurora for a moment, but he quickly averted his gaze again. Aurora watched him for a second, then sighed deeply to herself. Never mind, it's not important. Whatever you say, shrugged James, continuing to make his way toward the horses. As Sapphire and Paz loaded the heavy packs onto the sides of the horses, James heaved himself up onto his brown steed and helped Samuel climb up the stirrups to sit behind him. We should be good to go, Paz said, loudly patting one of the packs that now hung tightly from the horses' saddles. He and Sapphire swiftly mounted up onto their respective mounts, and he offered a hand towards Aurora. She smiled, grabbing his hand firmly and shakily pulling herself up onto the saddle. That just leaves us, Sapphire said, reaching out towards Zircon. He looked up at her blankly, not taking his hand from his pockets. Unless you want to walk. Zircon sighed and grumbled something unintelligible, then reached up and allowed her to pull him onto the horse. All saddled up, they finally trotted forward into the vibrant woods. They rode onwards past the tall trees, burning green under the strong rays of the sun, grateful for the deep, slanted shade that the forest offered them. But for the occasional question or brief conversation, all that greeted the senses of the travellers was the slow, constant trotting of the horses' hooves against the dirt, the gentle rustling of the trees in the intermittent breeze, and the occasional chirping of birds. By the time the sun had passed the centre of the sky, Pasley had slowed his horse to a gentle stop and swung himself over onto the ground, rattling a few pots and pans attached to the saddle. Break time, I'd say. James turned his head as his horse trotted past the halted Pasley, finally stopping a few metres ahead of him. Is it indeed? We should only be a few hours away. Before Pasley could respond, Zircon, too, swung himself off his horse and landed on the ground, almost losing his balance. I could do with something to eat, Samuel seconded, clutching his book in his arms and climbing off. James shrugged and promptly followed. Pasley led the others alongside the horses into the thin cluster of trees at the side of the road, laying down his pack against the gnarled trunk of an old oak. The others followed suit, spreading out amongst the dark, coarse soil of the forest floor. As James was past the reins of the horses, he rolled his eyes and stepped to the side of the clearing, beginning to tie them to the trunk of a spindly tree. Pasley stood beside him, reaching into one of the packs resting on the saddles. He rustled around for a few moments, then pulled out a large bundle of food wrapped in white cloth. While Aurora watched them absent-mindedly, she and Sapphire wandered over to the large trunk of a collapsed tree, crooked and bare from the passage of time. She took a seat on the rough dark grey bark and gazed up at the intermittent ceiling of bright green leaves, rustling and swaying from side to side in the breeze, blowing high above. "So," Sapphire said, catching her attention, "you think you're ready for what we might find up ahead?" Aurora looked down from the sky and turned to look at her. "Oh, I'm not sure. Are we expecting danger?" Sapphire shrugged and glanced towards the horizon. "I doubt it, but we're meddling in the affairs of a pretty dangerous person, and doing so in the path of a very dangerous creature." "Would it help if I had a sword?" Aurora asked, a glint of excitement obvious within her eyes. Sapphire chuckled to herself and reached down for the hilt of her blade, pulling it free in such a way that the ring of metal against metal echoed throughout the clearing. "It might, but it also might not," she said, turning side on to run her eyes up and down the razor-sharp side of her weapon. "Think what you will about our lifestyle, Aurora, but I can assure you that there's absolutely nothing desirable about having to use one of these." As Aurora focused on the gleaming metal in front of her, her gaze couldn't help but wander past it, where the lonely figure of Zircon stood toward the edge of the clearing. He didn't sit, nor did he lean against a tree. He simply stood there, back hunched, crossing his arms with his head hidden by both the hood of his cloak and the strands of dark hair falling past it. Aurora followed where he appeared to be looking, to find Samuel, also alone, sitting on a small log with his book resting on his legs while he turned another page. She couldn't help notice that he looked a little forlorn. Zircon stepped quietly across the forest floor towards Samuel, breathing in the open air that seemed to lighten him. He approached the small log on which the boy sat, and standing over him, finally spoke to gain his attention. "Hey there," he began. Samuel stared at his book obliviously for a few seconds, before his eyes jumped wide and he looked up, slamming the book shut. Zircon stared down at the boy for a moment, his brow slightly raised. "You all right there?" "Oh," replied Samuel slowly. "Yes, I suppose." He looked down blankly at the now closed book, his face seeming sad, anxious and exhausted. "Are you sure nothing's wrong?" Zircon asked, looking slightly hesitant as he lowered himself to sit on the log beside the boy. Samuel sighed and rested his hands on his book. "Sorry, I'm just a little nervous about what we're going to find." "Why's that?" probed Zircon, swallowing audibly. "Will it be dangerous?" "It's not that," Samuel assured. "It's just, if this map doesn't give us the key to stopping Jade, I don't know what more I'll be able to do." "Oh," replied Zircon, eyes drifting to Samuel's satchel on the ground behind him. "I'm sure you'll find a way." "I'm not so sure. Perhaps the others could. They know what they're doing. But me, I'm all but useless." "Huh?" replied Zircon, slightly taken aback by that comment. "You're joking, right?" Samuel's gaze did not shift, nor did his expression. Still confused, Zircon continued. "Kid, you've got more knowledge than anyone I've ever met. You've been able to investigate a powerful sorceress and a nightmare creature without being discovered or caught. How could you possibly consider yourself useless? Not to mention the fact that you can see magic. What couldn't you do with a gift like that?" "It's not a gift, it's a curse," Samuel finally responded, his voice quiet but tone harsher than usual. "A curse that keeps on leading me back to the forgotten." Samuel was staring intensely at his book now, as if it was a sponge that could drain away all of his anxiety, as if the whole world could disappear around him, if only for a few moments. It was an opportunity Zircon wasn't going to miss. He slowly and quietly lowered an arm down behind Samuel, towards his satchel lying on the ground. As he delicately unbuckled it and reached inside, though, Zircon couldn't help but feel a little confused at what the boy had just said, even while so intently focused on his nefarious task. Against his better judgment, he continued the conversation. "Samuel," he began, as he withdrew the round pouch from the satchel, hoping the boy wouldn't shift his gaze. "If you don't want to be involved with the Forgotten, then why are you doing all this?" Samuel, to Zircon's relief, didn't turn to look at him, now instead staring into the middle distance. "Because it's my responsibility," he replied. "To who?" "To me." Another extended moment of silence hung in the air, and Zircon used it to quickly and slyly place the pouch and his hands both into the large pockets of his cloak. "Right, anyway," he suddenly dismissed. "I'm sure you have it all in hand. I best get back to over there." Just as he had stood up from his seat, Samuel spoke again. "I've forgotten my past as well," the boy suddenly told him. "I don't know who I am. I just woke up in the woods with this book tied to my arm only a week ago, and I've been running around like a headless chicken ever since, trying to make sense of it all." Zircon turned back around and looked at Samuel quizzically, doubtfully, curiously. After a moment, he sat down again. "That can't be right," he said. "You told us all that information about Jade and about the Forgotten. You mean to tell me you worked all that out in a week?" Samuel shook his head and breathed an exasperated, shallow breath before pressing the tip of his finger to the cover of his book. "I read it all here. Hell, I only know my name because it was written in this thing. If you read it from cover to cover, you'd know as much as I do." Zircon narrowed his eyes at the book. His guarded demeanour seemed to give way to intense curiosity. "Who the hell wrote this thing then? Surely you should be looking for them." "I wrote it," said Samuel, flipping the book open carelessly and allowing a string of pages to flutter over from one side to the other. "It's my handwriting. I don't know how many times I've woken up and read this thing. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger." "So that's why you take so many notes," Zircon confirmed to himself, lifting his head in realisation. "I had thought it a little excessive." "You don't have to tell me," sighed Samuel, shaking his head weakly and looking down to his book again. "This is just one of many runs I've had. I just hope that one day there'll be a Samuel who can look back at it all and make it mean something." Zircon looked thoughtful towards the sky, and then back at Samuel. "And you don't think it could be you?" Samuel didn't answer the question, continuing to stare down at his book glumly. Zircon sucked in a breath and pursed his lips, then letting out a deep sigh as he hunched over and followed Samuel's gaze. "You know," he began, "I felt pretty confused as well when I lost my memories. Like I didn't know where I was going or where I was coming from. But you know what was even worse?" Samuel remained silent, not seeming to be interested in the answer. "What was worse for me was getting them back." Samuel's brow furrowed immediately, and he finally turned to look Zircon in the eyes with a confused, almost disbelieving expression. "How could you possibly find that to be a bad thing?" Zircon chuckled weakly to himself with a forced smile, as if he didn't quite understand himself. "When I didn't know who I was," he said, turning to Samuel with a sudden look of sorrowful understanding, "I was free to be whoever I wanted to be." Samuel stared at him expectantly, nodding his head slightly as if to urge him onward. "And what changed?" "When I got them back, I was just the same old Zircon. Samuel shook his head disbelievingly. But how can that have been a bad thing? Zircon hesitated and then shook his head as well. There's nothing good about being me, Samuel. That I don't need a huge book to know. Samuel glanced down then to his side, brow furrowed heavily in confused contemplation, before turning to Zircon suddenly. I'm not free at all, though. I've spent my whole life investigating the forgotten. It's my responsibility to solve this. That doesn't make you who you are, said Zircon, looking more certain than Samuel had gotten used to. If you feel responsibility for this, that's still your choice. You're not the same as all the other Samuels. You're certainly not beholden to them. You're free to live your life any way you choose. Because of what you've forgotten, the past doesn't control you. You're as free as they come. As Samuel looked down at himself, face heavy in thought and battling emotions, the two of them both heard Pasley's call that the others were getting ready to move out. Zircon looked down at the ground, his face seemingly conflicted for a moment, before he finally released a long sigh. Hey, he said to the boy. This rolled out of your bag. Samuel turned to look, his eyes going wide in shock, as Zircon held up the pouch that contained the eye. You probably ought to be more careful with it. Zircon leaned over and reached deep into Samuel's satchel, carefully placing the pouch there himself. I can't believe I was so careless, Samuel chastised himself, then slowly coming to rest his face in his hands. Thank you, Zircon, he said. Zircon shrugged. I just saw it on the ground, it's no big deal. Samuel shook his head. Not for that, for what you said. I think you might be right. Well, glad I could help. Zircon nodded, then he pushed himself up from the log and began to walk back towards the others with his hands in his pockets. After barely a few steps, he heard Samuel's voice call from behind him. But, Zircon, he began, as Zircon paused in his tracks. All that stuff you said about not being beholden to my past, could that not apply to you, too? Zircon stood stiffly, as if petrified mid-movement. But he shook himself out of it and, without turning around, spoke one final word to Samuel before making his way back to the others. No.